I think there's always been a hard drinking culture at Buckingham Palace. It's died down a lot in recent years, as it has done in many offices for a variety of reasons. Obviously, COVID has had an effect. The fact that people are working from home, we're more politically correct these days. But I must admit, when I saw this amazing story in the Sun this morning, Palace punch up and booze up, and saw that someone had been arrested and got drunk and started throwing glasses about in a pub, it did bring back some memories of previous stories that I've been associated with in the past. I have to say that it's sort of small beer, if you want to use that phrase, compared to some of the stories in the past. I mean, in 2004, there was a really, might call it Bacchanalia Palace party. And in those days, the late Queen and Prince Philip and some of their children used to mingle with the servants. About 500 people, of course, working at Buckingham Palace. And they would have a dance first, and they would have a meal in a separate room, and then they would mingle with the servants, and they would get out on the dance floor, and you'd see the Queen dancing with some of her favourite servants. It was really an amazing scene to see, and people loved doing it. But this one in 2004, it got slightly out of hand. It ended up in the end with two people being taken by ambulance. One guy fell down some stairs and broke his ankle. Another one had alcoholic poisoning. They were both taken to hospital. And a third guy, a third servant, I'm not going to name any of these people, it's probably been embarrassing for them. A third servant, Scotsman, ended up sleeping in the grounds of Buckingham Palace with his kilt up round his ears and the crown jewels on full display. And then quite a few maids apparently were extremely tipsy, struggling to stay in their high heels, and ended up throwing up in the bushes in the Buckingham Palace gardens. So it really was an old fashioned booze up, and that was 2004. So I'm not going to say I'm glad to see that some people are carrying on the traditions, but it doesn't surprise me. It's like any other office party really, and other people will know about this. There's always one or two people who perhaps they're not used to drinking, and it gets a bit out of hand, and they let their hair down once a year, and the Christmas party is the opportunity to do it. And sometimes they can't cope with it. But of course, unfortunately for royal servants, many of whom are extremely hardworking and not particularly well paid, it can end up in the papers. So yeah, there's always been a bit of a hard drinking culture at the palace. Not very well paid, the servants, and sometimes the perks made up for that. They used to work very long hours. And in fact, in the old days, it was actually written into their contracts that if there was a state banquet where there was more than 50 guests, they actually were entitled to a free drink supply. I think they were given some gin, a choice of gin, scotch, or a bottle of port. And also, they were given, amazingly, I don't think this still happens, but they were actually given permission to, quote, finish up the dregs. And this was actually written into their contract, whereby at the end of a state banquet, and of course, some of these wines were worth hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of pounds, some of the best wines you could possibly get that had been brought up from the royal cellars. They were allowed to take bottles of that to their room afterwards. And so they had some great parties late into the night, the servants, after they'd finished working, finishing up, Chateau Rothschilds and all sorts of amazing wines. That I think that perk was taken away from them in later years, but for a long time they all used to party quite well on that. And most of them in the old days used to get given a Christmas pudding. That used to come from Fulton and Masons. Then over the years, I think some cost cutting was done. I think they just got one from Tesco's. But yeah, their favourite servants are people who they see more of. Let's be honest, than some of their own family members, and they're closer to some of these people than they are to some of their family members. And there's a great deal of affection that builds up between servants and certain members of the royal family. But the royals have got great senses of humour. The Queen and Prince Philip always used to say, particularly when they were on royal tours, that they really enjoyed it when things went wrong. Because they're so used to everything running like clockwork, and they're so used to people sort of fawning all over them, and everything has to be done correctly. And some people are very nervous when they meet them. So when something goes wrong, and there's some sort of up and the lights go out or the lights fail at a banquet, which has happened in the past, or things like that. They actually think it's quite funny, and they do have a great sense of humour.